It was a late evening in Portland, the kind of evening when the air clung damp and cold, and the glow of streetlights pooled faintly against the mist. Julia Dawson stepped out of the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's office, tugging her coat tighter around her frame. After hours of dissecting silence in the morgue, the world outside felt no warmer. She breathed out, her exhale clouding in front of her, and crossed the parking lot toward her car. The hum of the city was distant here, muffled by the river fog. She slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and let the low vibration of the engine fill the emptiness. For a moment she sat still, watching raindrops trace crooked paths down the windshield, cigarette smoke curling from between her fingers. There had been a time when going home after a shift meant relief, comfort, even laughter. Lately, the thought of home had grown heavy. Her husband, Michael Dawson, was a crime scene investigator. They had met years ago when their professional paths first crossed. Back then it had seemed almost poetic. Two people bound by death yet tethered by life, drawn together by the strange intimacy of working with what remained of others. Their bond had been fierce. They had laughed in the face of exhaustion, kissed in the fluorescent corridors, stolen moments between duties. But the years had sharpened the edges of their lives, and those edges now cut at each other. The decline had been subtle at first. Michael started picking up extra shifts, long stretches of nights away from home. He claimed crime didn't wait for anyone, that the workload was crushing, that overtime was inevitable. But Julia knew the rhythm of their department, knew the ebb and flow of cases, and something about his excuses rang hollow. Soon the signs began to stack like bricks, forming a wall she could no longer ignore. It began with the scent. Michael would come home, his shirt faintly perfumed with something floral, something expensive, something that did not belong to either of them. Once, as she leaned in to hug him after he walked through the door, she caught the sharp, unfamiliar trace of it and felt her chest tighten. Another time, as she reached for the laundry, she discovered strands of hair clinging to his jacket. Long, fine, and pale, nothing like her own dark waves. Then came the calls. He would step into the bathroom with his phone pressed to his ear, turning on the faucet as though running water could disguise the muffled whispers. She'd pass the door and hear the cadence of his voice drop, low and secretive, punctuated by silences that seemed louder than words. When she asked casually who he was talking to, he shrugged it off. Colleagues, reports, routine follow-ups. His tone was clipped, defensive. Julia Dawson was not a woman easily rattled. Her profession demanded composure in the face of horror, demanded steady hands when others faltered. She had trained herself to stand over broken bodies and carve through lies written in bruises and blood. But betrayal left no autopsy report, no evidence file she could dissect under a microscope. It seeped in quietly, like rot beneath the floorboards. At first, she wanted to believe it was stress, that she was imagining shadows in corners that weren't there. She told herself every couple drifted through rough seasons, that routine dulled passion, that maybe she had been too consumed with work. Yet, even as she whispered those justifications into the quiet of their bedroom, the doubts burned hotter. The man who once kissed her with hunger now brushed past her without looking. The laughter that once echoed in their kitchen had gone silent, replaced by long stretches of Michael scrolling on his phone, screen tilted just out of her view. Still, Julia refused to give him the satisfaction of an outburst. Rage was easy, but rage was also wasteful. Screaming would only place her in the role of the hysterical wife, flailing against inevitability. That wasn't who she was. If Michael thought she was blind, if he thought she was weak, he had forgotten who he had married. Beneath the stillness of her gaze, calculation stirred. She began to watch. Not openly, never in a way that would invite suspicion. Instead, she noted his patterns. When he left, how long he stayed gone. The slip of his expression when he read a message he didn't share. She stored each piece away like evidence in a case file, each one corroborating the theory she already knew to be true. Her colleagues noticed the strain. Rachel Myers, her closest friend in the department, asked one night over coffee if everything was all right. Julia smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing, and changed the subject to their latest case. She had no intention of bearing her private wounds to anyone, not yet. Back home, Michael seemed oblivious to the quiet storm gathering behind her eyes. He carried on with his excuses, his late nights, his faint traces of perfume and lies. Julia played the part of the weary but supportive wife, nodding, murmuring, sipping her wine on the balcony as though nothing gnawed at her insides. Inside, however, something else had begun to take root. She could almost feel it, the shift within herself. Where another woman might have chosen confrontation, Julia chose patience. Where another might have sought tears, she chose silence. She had spent her career piecing together what others tried to conceal, reading stories etched into skin and bone. Now she would apply those same skills to her own life. She would not confront Michael with accusations he could deny. She would not hand him an easy escape. She would wait, and when the time came, she would act. For now, Julia lit another cigarette, watching the ember glow in the dark. Across the city, Michael was somewhere else, with someone else, and she knew it. But her pulse remained steady, her face calm. He thought she was blind. He thought she was docile. He had no idea. The following morning, Michael returned from his supposed overnight shift earlier than expected. He tossed his keys onto the counter and announced, with a stretch that looked rehearsed, that he needed to drive out to their lake house near Forest Park. The winter tires, he said, had to be swapped before spring fully settled in. Julia paused at the sink, her hand submerged in soapy water, and glanced over her shoulder. His tone was casual, but she recognized the flicker in his eyes. There was no urgency in Portland's mild weather, no reason he needed to rush out there on this particular day. She dried her hands, slowly, feigning indifference. Why today? Couldn't it wait until our days off match? She asked, letting the question float as if it were nothing more than idle suggestion. Michael shrugged, already half-turned toward the hallway. No point waiting. I'll take care of the tires, stack the firewood, maybe clean up the place. You've got another shift tonight anyway, right? What else am I supposed to do at home alone? Julia studied him, silent, and then nodded. Fine. Do what you want. She made no argument, no accusation. Instead, she stored the detail away. He was impatient. He wanted the lake house, which meant she had found her opening. As soon as Michael retreated to the bedroom for a nap before leaving, Julia picked up her phone and dialed. She reached a colleague who owed her more than one favor. I need you to cover my shift tonight, she said plainly, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. It's important. There was a groan on the other end, followed by reluctant agreement. Julia thanked him softly and hung up. Her hand shook only once, when she slipped her coat over her shoulders that evening, long after Michael had driven away with a self-satisfied grin. She steadied them quickly. It was time to stop wondering and start knowing. The drive out of the city stretched in silence. Pine trees lined the roads, their silhouettes etched black against the fading sky. The air grew colder as she neared the edge of the woods where their lake house sat tucked between birch groves and water. She had once loved this place. It had been their sanctuary, the escape where they grilled on summer evenings, wrapped themselves in blankets by the fireplace, and dreamed of a family. The memory was bitter now, sharp against the inside of her chest. Julia parked 2 streets over, far enough to remain unseen, and walked the rest of the way. The ground was soft under her boots, the grass wet with early dew. As she approached the familiar gate, her heart hammered against her ribs. She slipped inside quietly, grateful for the hinges she had nagged Michael to oil last year. Each step carried her closer to confirmation, closer to the betrayal she already knew but needed to see with her own eyes. The house was lit from within. Through the open window, she heard voices, the cadence unmistakably intimate. She crept to the side, crouching behind the shrubs where she once planted hydrangeas. Her breath caught when she finally glimpsed them. Michael sat at the dining table, a bottle of wine between him and Crystal Moore. Crystal, the secretary from the office. Julia had disliked her the moment they met. Too much perfume, a smile that never reached her eyes, an air of someone who measured everyone else and found them lacking. Now, watching her in Julia's own house, in Julia's own chair, the disdain hardened into fury. Crystal leaned in, laughter spilling too loud in the quiet night, the sound slicing into Julia like glass. Michael laughed too, though his smile faltered, as if guilt itched at the edges. He reached for Crystal's hand, and she let him, tilting her head in mock shyness. Julia's nails dug crescents into her palms. Why do we have to keep sneaking around? Crystal's voice carried clearly through the crack of the window. I'm tired of hiding. You need to leave her, Michael. End it. Julia froze, every word burning into her. Michael shook his head, his voice low, coaxing. It's not that simple. Give me time. Things will change. Crystal pulled back her hand with a pout, the wine glass trembling slightly as she raised it to her lips. You've been saying that for months. Either you're with me or you're not. I won't play the side piece forever. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I promise, Crystal. Soon. You just have to trust me. Julia's stomach twisted. There it was, the truth in its rawest form. Not speculation, not suspicion. Betrayal, living and breathing in her home. She could have burst through the door right then, could have shattered the charade with screaming and broken glass. But she didn't. Instead, she forced herself to inhale deeply, to let the fury cool into something sharper. Rage was a flame, control was a blade, and Julia knew blades cut deeper. Her vision blurred with tears as she pulled away from the window. The laughter inside grew muffled behind her as she slipped back through the gate, each step heavier than the last. She returned to her car and sat behind the wheel, gripping it so hard her knuckles whitened. For long minutes, she didn't start the engine. Her body shook, not with weakness, but with a storm she was already learning to harness. She whispered into the empty car, "You have no idea what you've done." Her reflection in the rearview mirror was pale, eyes hollowed by grief and ignited by something far more dangerous. Julia Dawson had seen death in all its forms, had stood over bodies discarded by violence and cruelty. But betrayal had its own anatomy, and tonight she had learned where the heart of it lay. When she finally turned the key and drove away, it was not with despair, but with resolve. The woman who had crouched in the bushes was gone. In her place sat someone colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The lake house lights disappeared behind her, swallowed by the dark forest. Inside, Michael poured Crystal another glass of wine, oblivious to the fact that Julia had seen enough, oblivious to the truth that his wife was already imagining the first steps of a plan he would never see coming. When Julia returned to the apartment in Portland that night, the city outside had already fallen into its usual hush. Streetlights glowed faint through the fog, and the sound of traffic was little more than a dull hum against the windows. She opened the door quietly, stepping into the familiar smell of their home. Michael was stretched out on the couch, television flickering across his face. He looked up with the bored glance of a man caught halfway between guilt and routine. "You're home early," he said, as if it mattered. "They let me off," Julia replied evenly, slipping out of her coat and hanging it on the hook. Her voice betrayed nothing. She moved into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter as though nothing had shifted in the world. Michael muttered something about being tired and padded off toward the bedroom. Julia watched him go, her face still and unreadable. When the sound of running water drifted down the hallway, she noticed his phone abandoned on the coffee table. Careless. He was so sure of his deception that he hadn't even bothered to keep it near. She crossed the room slowly, her fingers hovering for a moment above the device before picking it up. The screen lit beneath her touch. He had always been predictable. 3 passcodes he used for everything. On the second attempt, the phone opened. There it was, messages, half-hidden threads of conversations, fragments of desire exchanged in hurried words. She scrolled, not because she needed more proof, she had already seen enough, but because knowledge was power. She memorized names, times the rhythm of his betrayal. Then, with the precision she reserved for an autopsy, she installed an app that would mirror everything onto her own device. Monitor Sync, a tool she had once recommended to a victim's family, now turned against her own husband. By the time she set the phone back onto the table, Michael had returned, hair damp, wearing a fresh t-shirt. He didn't notice a thing. The next day, Julia met Rachel Myers for coffee. They had known each other for years, their friendship forged in the exhaustion of night shifts and the intimacy of unspeakable cases. Rachel had a detective's sharp eyes and the heart of someone who still believed in right and wrong. She arrived late, as always, dropping into the chair across from Julia with a sigh. "You look pale," Rachel said, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug. "Rough week." Julia studied the dark surface of her own drink, then raised her gaze. There was no point in dodging. "Michael's having an affair. I saw them at the lake house. Crystal Moore." Rachel's face darkened, a flash of disgust. "That secretary? Jesus, Julia. I'm so sorry. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Julia replied, her voice steady. "I watched them together. I heard her ask him to leave me. He didn't deny it." For a long moment, Rachel said nothing. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on Julia's. "Then leave him. You deserve better. File for divorce. Cut him out. Don't waste yourself on this." Julia gave a small, cold smile. "Divorce is inevitable, but not yet." Rachel blinked. "What do you mean, not yet?" "I don't want to just walk away." Julia's tone was calm, almost detached, but her eyes burned. "I want him to feel what I felt when I stood outside that window. I want him to understand what it means to be humiliated, powerless, trapped." Rachel withdrew her hand, frowning. "Julia, that's dangerous talk. You're a doctor. You know where this road leads. Don't let him drag you into something that could ruin your life." Julia shook her head slowly. "This isn't about losing control. It's about control. For years, I've spent my days uncovering the truth behind other people's violence. I've documented it, dissected it, explained it. I know better than anyone what people can do to each other. But now it's my turn to choose how the story plays out." Rachel leaned back, unease written across her face. "So what? You're planning some kind of revenge? That's not who you are." Julia's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't know who I am anymore." The cafe around them buzzed with ordinary life, students laughing in the corner, a barista calling out orders, the clatter of cups. But between them stretched a silence heavy with something unspoken. Rachel searched her friend's face, hoping to find hesitation. Instead, she saw resolve. "Julia, I'm begging you. Just let it go. Walk away clean. Don't taint yourself because of him." But Julia's mind was elsewhere, already sketching outlines of a plan. She thought of the morgue, of the countless bodies that passed through her hands. She thought of the lies Michael whispered into Crystal's ear, the scent of perfume that clung to his shirts. Rage simmered beneath her skin, but she kept it pressed down, shaping it, molding it into something she could wield. She lifted her cup, taking a slow sip, and met Rachel's worried eyes. "Some betrayals," she said softly, "demand something more than silence." Rachel exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Just promise me you'll think about what you're saying." "I will," Julia answered, but it was a lie. The promise wasn't for Rachel, it was for herself. She would think about it, every detail, every step, every consequence. And she would not rest until the plan was complete. When they parted, Rachel hugged her tightly, whispering again that she deserved happiness, not vengeance. Julia hugged back, her expression serene. She said nothing more. Later, back in her apartment, Julia sat alone at the dining table. Michael's laughter echoed faintly from the bedroom where he scrolled on his phone, oblivious to the fact that every message he typed now bled onto her screen as well. She watched the mirrored feed, each line a nail in the coffin of what they once had. The fury inside her was no longer wild. It was quiet, focused, sharpening like a scalpel. She had no intention of lashing out blindly. No, Julia Dawson would not scream, would not plead, would not crumble. She would wait, observe, and strike when the moment was perfect. And for the first time since suspicion had taken root, she felt something that almost resembled relief. The beginning of a design had taken shape in her mind, a cruel, precise design that would make Michael understand the cost of betraying her. The following week, Julia moved through her routine with unnerving calm. Each day at the medical examiner's office was predictable. Cold corridors, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the endless shuffle of case files. But beneath the monotony, her mind worked with mechanical precision, layering step upon step of what she now considered inevitable. Michael had grown more careless, more comfortable in his deceit. He hummed when he shaved, scrolled his phone with a smirk tugging at his lips, and wore shirts pressed as though for someone who noticed such details. Julia played her role to perfection, never once betraying the storm that churned behind her eyes. If anything, she leaned further into the facade of exhaustion, sighing heavily as though the weight of her shifts was the only thing eroding her energy. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen sorting through mail, she let her voice drift casually toward the living room. "They've added me to another overnight shift this weekend. Saturday. I'll be stuck at the morgue all night." Michael glanced up from his laptop, feigning sympathy, poorly. "That's rough. Again? Don't they realize you're human?" Julia smiled faintly, shaking her head. "It's fine. At least it means you don't have to sit around here being bored. You could use the time. Maybe get some fresh air, go check on the lake house. I noticed the roof looked rough the last time I was there." It was bait, delivered with the precision of someone who had studied human behavior as long as she had studied anatomy. Michael's eyes lit, just slightly. He tried to smother it, but Julia saw. "Yeah," he said slowly, closing his laptop with a deliberate gesture. "That's not a bad idea. I've been meaning to take care of a few things out there anyway." Her smile didn't waver. "Do it. It'll keep you busy while I'm gone." By the following day, she saw the mirrored messages appear on her phone. "Saturday night. She's working. Come out to the house. We'll have it to ourselves." Crystal's reply was a string of hearts, followed by a promise to bring wine. Julia read it in silence, her pulse steady. The trap had closed as easily as snapping on latex gloves. But bait was only half the plan. To execute the rest, she needed assistance and discretion. That meant Ethan Carter. Ethan was a night orderly at the morgue, young enough to still think he was invincible, desperate enough to need money, and too inexperienced to ask the wrong questions. Julia had noticed him months ago, lugging files with one hand while texting with the other, always eager to please. She found him in the break room late on Thursday, bent over a sandwich and his phone. She stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind her, and watched him jolt upright. "Dr. Dawson," he said, straightening quickly. "Didn't see you." Julia set her coffee on the table and sat across from him. Her tone was conversational, almost light. "I need your help with something off the record." Suspicion flickered across his face, but curiosity won. "Okay, what kind of help?" She leaned back, studying him. "There's an unclaimed body in storage. No family, no paperwork moving anytime soon. I need it moved for a short period discreetly. In exchange, you'll have a week's pay in cash." His sandwich lay forgotten. "Wait, you mean moved where?" "That isn't your concern," Julia said softly, her gaze holding his until he looked away. "All you need to know is it won't leave county lines, it will be returned exactly as it was, and no harm will come to your job if you cooperate. Quite the opposite. You'll be compensated." Ethan hesitated, chewing on his lip. "Is this legal?" Julia tilted her head. "Do you want it to be legal, or do you want it to be profitable? Think carefully. I wouldn't ask if I didn't trust you." It took less than a minute. His shoulders dropped, and he gave a crooked smile meant to mask his nerves. "Fine. What do you need me to do?" "Help me transport the body Saturday night," Julia said, her voice calm, as though discussing a grocery list. "We'll use my vehicle. No one will suspect. You keep watch at the morgue, help me load, and then you're done." Ethan nodded slowly. "Cash up front." "You'll have it." She rose, collecting her coffee, and paused at the door. "One more thing, Ethan. Not a word. Ever." He swallowed hard. "Understood." On Saturday evening, as rain slicked the streets of Portland, Julia drove to the medical examiner's office. Ethan was already waiting by the service entrance, jittery but resolute. The morgue was quiet, staff minimal on weekends. Together, they wheeled the gurney down the dim corridor, its metal rattling faintly against the linoleum. The body was tagged as John Doe, mid-40s, no next of kin. Julia had performed the preliminary exam herself. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. In a way that made him perfect. She draped a clean sheet over the form, tucking it tightly. Ethan's hands trembled on the gurney's rails. "Feels wrong." Julia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You get used to wrong in this job." They slid the gurney into the back of her SUV. She counted out a wad of bills and pressed it into his palm. "Go back inside. Act normal. You never saw me tonight." Ethan pocketed the money quickly, his eyes darting around the empty lot. "Good luck, Dr. Dawson." Julia closed the hatch with a soft thud. The weight of the body settled the suspension of the vehicle, as if anchoring the night itself. She drove away, headlights slicing through the rain, her face calm and controlled. The plan was set in motion. By the time Michael and Crystal stepped into the lake house, everything would already be in place. Julia wasn't just a wife anymore. She wasn't just a doctor. She was an architect, constructing a scene with all the precision of her profession. In her mind, the morgue and the marriage had blurred into one. And now, at last, she was ready to conduct her own experiment. An experiment in betrayal, fear, and silence. A crime scene staged not for the courts, but for justice only she would recognize. The lake house was silent when Julia arrived, its windows glowing faintly against the surrounding forest. She parked down the road and carried her equipment with a composure that bordered on clinical. The SUV still held its grim cargo, wrapped tightly in the white sheet. She unloaded it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lifted countless bodies before, her motions precise, unhurried. To Julia Dawson, this was no longer a home, it was a stage. Inside, Michael was already half asleep in the bedroom. He had come ahead to prepare the place for Crystal, oblivious to the predator moving in his own shadow. Julia set her bag down quietly, slipping a pair of gloves over her hands. She filled a syringe with a carefully measured dose of sedative, her mind cool and detached. This wasn't rage. This was method. She entered the bedroom without sound. Michael stirred, confused, as the faint light of her flashlight crossed his face. "Julia!" he muttered, voice thick with sleep. She didn't answer. The needle slid into his arm before he could rise. The plunger pressed smoothly down. His protest dissolved into a slurred whisper, eyes rolling back as his body sank heavily against the mattress. Julia stood over him, watching as his breathing slowed into the deep rhythm of unconsciousness. For years he had thought her weak, blind. Now he would learn the truth, that she had always been capable of cutting deeper than he imagined. She placed his phone on the nightstand, unlocked with ease. Her fingers flew across the screen, composing a message to Crystal. "Come up. Bedroom's ready. I want you now." She hit send, then set the device back into Michael's limp hand, arranging his body to look as though he were merely resting. Then she turned to her cargo. She hauled the sheet-wrapped corpse onto the other side of the bed, her muscles straining with the effort. The dead weight was familiar, almost comforting. She positioned the body carefully, pulling the blanket up to its chin, tucking the edges so that in dim light it would pass for Michael himself. The irony was exquisite. Michael unconscious beside a stranger's corpse, his mistress moments away from discovering the truth. Julia adjusted the lamp so it cast only shadows, then stepped back into the far corner, swallowed by darkness. It wasn't long before she heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a car door. Footsteps hurried across the porch, a key fumbling into the lock. Julia's breath remained steady as Crystal Moore entered the house, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She moved with confidence, humming under her breath as she climbed the stairs. "Michael." Crystal's voice floated into the bedroom, playful, expectant. She set down a bottle of wine with a clink and kicked off her shoes. "You didn't lock the door, you naughty man." She slipped inside, the glow from the hallway spilling across the bed. From Julia's vantage point, Crystal looked almost childlike in her excitement, tugging off her coat, smoothing her hair. She crawled onto the mattress with a giggle, sliding beneath the covers beside the figure she thought was her lover. Her hand reached out, brushing the cold flesh. At first she laughed, assuming it was simply chilled by the air. But then her fingers pressed harder, encountering rigidity, the unmistakable lifelessness beneath the sheet. Her laugh broke, faltered into silence. Crystal pulled the blanket back, just enough to see the face. What greeted her was not Michael's warmth, but the waxen stillness of a corpse, eyes half-lidded, skin pale against the shadows. For a second, she could not breathe. Then the scream tore out of her throat, raw and piercing, echoing off the walls of the lake house. She stumbled back, clawing at the sheets as though they burned her. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" she shrieked, tumbling off the bed and hitting the floor with a thud. Her sobs broke into hysterical gasps as she crawled backward, her gaze locked on the dead face that mocked her desire. It was then Julia stepped forward. She emerged from the corner like a shadow gaining flesh, her eyes glinting in the dim light. She didn't speak at first, simply watching Crystal writhe in terror. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a cruel one, but a smile of cold satisfaction, calm, measured, inevitable. Crystal froze, her sobs cutting into silence as recognition dawned. "Why you?" "Julia! Oh my God!" Julia tilted her head, her voice low and even, surprised to find what love really looks like. "Crystal!" Crystal shook her head violently, her hands trembling as she pointed at the bed. "You're insane! What have you done?" Julia didn't answer. She let the silence choke the room, let the mistress drown in her own imagination. Every second stretched, like an eternity, Crystal's terror feeding the air until it grew suffocating. Crystal's wails returned, louder now, shrill with panic. She stumbled to her feet, backing into the dresser, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her mascara streaking down her cheeks as she sobbed uncontrollably. Julia remained still, arms crossed, her expression composed. Watching Crystal unravel was not pleasure in the ordinary sense. It was something sharper, darker, a vindication carved out of betrayal. Crystal clawed at the doorknob, fumbling to escape, her screams rising higher. "Michael! Michael!" she cried, unaware that he lay unconscious only a few feet away. Julia took one step closer, her shadow stretching across the floor. "You wanted him, Crystal. You wanted this bed. Now you have it. How does it feel?" The words sliced through the chaos, and Crystal collapsed against the wall, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "You're sick. You're both sick." Julia's smile never wavered. She turned toward the door, her footsteps calm against the floorboards, and left Crystal screaming in the darkened room. The sound followed her down the hallway, mingling with the storm outside. Behind her, the corpse remained where she had placed it, an unyielding witness to betrayal and fear. Crystal's cries rose and fell, jagged and wild, as if her mind were breaking piece by piece. Julia stepped out into the night, pulling her coat tighter around her. The cold air rushed into her lungs, washing away the stench of the scene she had orchestrated. She did not look back. Inside, the woman who had thought she could take Julia's life apart was unraveling, her screams echoing into the forest. The perfect experiment had begun, and Julia Dawson was the only one who knew the rules. The night was heavy with rain when Julia Dawson returned to the lake house, Hours after leaving Crystal, more screaming into the dark. The forest swallowed every sound except the water dripping from branches and the distant echo of Crystal's hysteria that had long since dwindled into silence. Julia's expression was calm, her movements methodical. She had allowed fear to do its work. Now it was time to erase the scene. Michael remained unconscious, slumped across the bed where she had left him. Crystal was gone. Whether she had fled to her car or collapsed somewhere along the roadside, Julia didn't care. The important part was the body. The corpse lay exactly as she had positioned it, still beneath the sheet, a grotesque stand-in for her husband's sins. She pulled on her gloves and crossed the room. With practiced efficiency, she wrapped the body again, securing the sheet tightly around its limbs. The dead weight strained her muscles, but she didn't falter. She had lifted heavier before in colder rooms under brighter lights. Tonight, she lifted not as a doctor, but as an executioner tidying her stage. Downstairs, she opened the back door to find Hank leaning against the porch rail. He was a permanent fixture in the neighborhood, a man whose veins carried more alcohol than blood. His unkempt hair dripped with rain, and his breath reeked of whiskey. Julia had left him a message earlier that evening, a simple offer, help for a bottle. Hank never refused a drink. "You said you needed muscle," Hank slurred, squinting at her through the downpour. "What you got there?" "Furniture." Julia regarded him coolly, her voice flat. "Something like that. Help me load it, and the bottle's yours." She handed him a paper bag. Inside, a liter of cheap bourbon glistened through the glass. His grin spread wide, yellowed teeth catching the dim porch light. Without another word, he stumbled after her, steady enough when promised his reward. Together, they maneuvered the body down the narrow staircase. Hank grunted, nearly losing his grip once, but Julia steadied the weight without panic. Her strength was deceptive, honed by years of handling cadavers. At last, they slid the form into the back of her SUV. The suspension dipped, the vehicle groaning under the mass. Hank wiped his forehead, rain mixing with sweat. "Damn heavy. What did you say this was?" Julia handed him the bourbon, her gaze unyielding. "Not your concern. You did your part. Now disappear." He accepted the answer without hesitation, already unscrewing the cap and taking a swig that burned down his throat. "Fair enough. You're a strange one, Doc, but you pay better than most." He stumbled back into the darkness, bottle clutched like treasure. Alone again, Julia closed the hatch, her gloves slick with rain. She slid behind the wheel, the engine rumbling beneath her, and drove back toward Portland with steady hands. The corpse lay silent in the back, a passenger bound for its rightful place. The medical examiner's office was nearly deserted when she arrived before dawn. Ethan Carter waited by the service entrance, jittery, eyes darting nervously around the empty lot. When she stepped out of the SUV, his shoulders sagged with relief. "You really did it," he whispered. Julia gestured for him to help. Together, they wheeled the gurney inside, the hallways echoing faintly with the squeak of rubber wheels. She guided him down the sterile corridor to the refrigerated unit. The lock clicked open, the door swinging wide to reveal rows of silent forms. They slid the body back into its compartment, exactly where it belonged. Julia stripped the sheet away and folded it neatly, her motions clean and precise. She adjusted the tag at the corpse's toe, ensuring it appeared untouched. To anyone who checked, nothing would seem amiss. Ethan exhaled shakily. "No one saw us. No one will ever know." Julia peeled off her gloves, dropping them into the biohazard bin. "Good. Forget this night, Ethan. If you can't forget it, at least never speak of it." He nodded rapidly, clutching his jacket as though it could shield him from the weight of what they had done. He left without another word. Julia lingered, staring into the cold glow of the morgue. For years, this place had been her domain, her cathedral of silence. Tonight, it had become her accomplice. When she returned home later that morning, the apartment was quiet. Michael had not come back. His car was still at the lake house. Julia stood in the entryway, surveying the familiar rooms. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, seemed stripped of meaning. Their life together was already dead, a cadaver waiting for burial. She walked to her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. Her resignation letter formed in neat, deliberate lines, effective immediately. No explanation, no apology. She folded it, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in her bag. Portland had nothing left to offer her. As she packed a small suitcase, her movements were calm, deliberate. Clothes, documents, cash she had set aside for emergencies. Each item placed with precision, as though preparing for an autopsy. She paused only once, her hand brushing across her wedding ring. She twisted it free and set it on the dresser. Julia Dawson did not cry. She did not rage. She simply prepared. The experiment was complete. The body had been returned, the stage wiped clean, the accomplices paid and silenced. Now it was time to step away, to leave behind the city where her marriage had rotted and her vengeance had bloomed. By the time the sun lifted weakly over Portland, Julia was ready. The streets outside glistened with rain, the river swollen and restless. She carried her bag to the door, paused for a moment in the stillness, then turned the lock. Behind her, the life of Julia Dawson the wife, the dutiful doctor, dissolved into memory. Ahead of her stretched only the unknown, cold, silent, and waiting. The room was dim when Michael Dawson stirred, his eyelids fluttering against the faint glow of morning that seeped through the curtains. His head throbbed, heavy and clouded, as though he had been dragged from the depths of a drowning sleep. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him felt unfamiliar, blurred at the edges. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick. He tried to sit up, but his limbs resisted, sluggish and unresponsive. Then memory pierced through the haze, a figure leaning over him in the night, the gleam of a syringe, Julia's face half-shrouded in shadow. He had thought it a dream, some twisted hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but the soreness in his arm told him otherwise. "Michael!" The voice shattered his fog. He turned, squinting, and found Crystal more crouched against the far wall. Her makeup was streaked down her cheeks, her hair a tangled mess. She looked as though she had aged years in the span of a night. What the hell happened?" Michael muttered, forcing himself upright. His body trembled under its own weight. Why are you crying like that?" Crystal scrambled toward him, clutching at his shirt with shaking hands. "She was here, Michael. Julia was here. I saw her. She put me in bed with a corpse." Michael froze, staring at her as though she had lost her mind. "What are you talking about?" "I swear to God I climbed into bed, and it wasn't you. It was a dead man." Her words tumbled out, jagged and frantic. "Cold, stiff, his face, oh my God, his face!" She broke into sobs, burying her face against his chest. Michael's breath caught, panic scraping at the edges of his disbelief. He pushed her back gently, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Crystal, listen to yourself. You're hysterical. You must have imagined it." "I didn't imagine it," she screamed, her voice cracking. She was standing right there in the corner. She smiled at me, Michael. She smiled like she wasn't even human. The words sent a chill crawling down his spine. He remembered the glint of the syringe, the way Julia's expression had been unreadable as he sank into blackness. Could it be possible? Could she have? He shook his head violently. No, Julia was a doctor, a professional. She dealt with the dead, yes, but she wasn't insane. She couldn't have staged something so grotesque, and yet the certainty he once held had slipped through his fingers. Michael staggered to his feet, dragging Crystal with him. The bed was rumpled, the sheets twisted. He yanked them back, expecting to find something. But there was nothing there now. No corpse, no proof, only emptiness. Crystal let out a choked sob. "It was here, I swear it was here. She brought it. She put it under the covers." Michael ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room, his breath uneven. If there was a body, where the hell is it now? Where did it go? His eyes darted to the floor, to the window, as though the answer might appear if he looked hard enough. Crystal clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. We have to get out. Please, Michael. I can't stay here another second. He hesitated. The house, once a place of retreat, now felt like a trap. The shadows pressed too close, the silence too thick. And that memory, that flash of Julia's cold eyes, gnawed at him with unbearable weight. Fine, he muttered, pulling her toward the door. We're leaving. Now. They stumbled down the staircase, Crystal trembling, so violently she nearly collapsed, on each step. Outside, the rain had ceased, but the forest loomed dark and endless. Michael's car sat slick with water, beads of it glinting in the pale dawn. Crystal climbed in, rocking back and forth as though motion could soothe her unraveling mind. Michael gripped the wheel, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. He looked like a ghost. As the engine roared to life, Crystal's sobs filled the cabin. She'll kill us, Michael. She'll kill us both. I saw it in her eyes. Stop it, he snapped, though his own voice cracked. She's not going to kill anyone. She's angry, that's all. You don't understand. Crystal's voice rose, high-pitched and desperate. She wanted me to suffer. She put me in bed with death. Do you know what that does to someone? I can still feel his skin on my hand. She broke into fresh sobs, clawing at her own palms as though to erase the memory. Michael gritted his teeth and pressed the accelerator. The house disappeared behind them, swallowed by trees and mist. Yet the image remained burned into his mind. Julia leaning over him with the syringe, Crystal's shrieks echoing through the walls. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe Crystal was hysterical, to believe Julia had simply lost her temper. But the unease would not leave him. Julia was not a woman who lashed out blindly. If she had come here, if she had gone this far, then what else was she capable of? Crystal's breathing grew ragged beside him. She curled into herself, mumbling incoherent fragments. Dead man, cold face, her smile. She repeated it again and again until her words blurred into sobbing. By the time they reached Portland, Michael knew the truth. Whether or not there had been a corpse in that bed, Julia had broken something in Crystal beyond repair. The woman beside him was unraveling, her mind trapped in the nightmare Julia had built. He pulled into her apartment complex and tried to coax her out of the car, but she refused, clutching the seatbelt as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Don't leave me alone, she begged, her eyes wide and wild. Don't let her find me. Michael swallowed hard, feeling the weight of a reality he couldn't escape. Julia had struck a blow he hadn't seen coming, not with fists or knives, but with fear itself. As he stood in the rain outside Crystal's building, he realized something chilling. Julia didn't need to kill either of them. She had already destroyed them. Michael Dawson drove through Portland with the desperation of a man searching for a lifeline. The city looked the same as it always had. Bridges stretching over the Willamette, traffic lights flickering red and green in the drizzle, but to him it felt alien, hostile. His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened, his thoughts circling back to the lake house, to Crystal's screams, to Julia's face in the shadows. He pulled into the lot of the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's office just after dawn. The building stood gray and unyielding against the mist, its walls offering the same sterile comfort they always had. He strode inside, ignoring the receptionist's wary glance, and demanded to know where his wife was. Julia Dawson, the receptionist repeated, flipping through a file. She turned in her resignation, effective immediately. Michael froze. That's not possible. She works here. She's here. The woman shook her head firmly. Not anymore. She cleared out her office last night, left her badge, her keys. There's nothing left for her here. Her words landed like a hammer. Michael staggered back a step, suddenly aware of the curious stares from passing staff. Julia had severed herself cleanly, efficiently, as though she had been preparing for weeks. She hadn't just walked out of her job. She had walked out of his reach entirely. He left the building in a daze, the drizzle slicking his hair to his forehead. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fumbled it out. A message from Crystal, the first since the lake house. His chest tightened as he opened it. "I can't see you. Don't call. Don't come near me. I'm getting help." He tried to call anyway, but she didn't answer. He called again. Nothing. He drove to her apartment, but the doorman stopped him at the lobby. "Miss Moore left instructions. No visitors, especially you." Michael's protests fell flat. He could still hear her voice from that night, shrill with terror. "She put me in bed with a corpse. She smiled at me like she wasn't even human." Crystal's mind had fractured under Julia's design, leaving her a ghost of the confident woman she had once been. Now she was under psychiatric care, and he was barred from seeing her. He returned home with the grim determination of a man who refused to accept finality. The apartment was still and cold, shadows gathering in corners that once held laughter. He moved from room to room, searching for something, anything, that proved Julia would come back. But each door he opened, each closet he peered into, offered only emptiness. When he reached the bedroom, he saw it. The dresser was bare, her clothes gone, her books stripped from the shelves. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the last trace of her presence. On the nightstand sat a single object, her wedding ring, glinting in the pale light. Michael stared at it for a long time, his throat constricting. He reached out, lifted it between his fingers. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with finality. She hadn't left him a note. She hadn't left him a word. Just silence, polished into a circle of gold. He sat on the edge of the bed, the ring balanced in his palm. Memories clawed at him. Julia laughing in the early days of their marriage. Julia resting her head against his shoulder. Julia's calm voice when she spoke of the dead as though they were simply stories waiting to be told. He had thought she would never leave. He had believed her devotion was unshakable. Now he understood. She hadn't left in weakness. She had left in triumph. The days blurred after that. Michael went to work but couldn't focus. He scrolled through his phone constantly, waiting for a message from Crystal that never came. His colleagues began to whisper, noticing the hollowness in his eyes, the way he jumped at shadows. He stopped shaving, stopped cooking, stopped caring. His apartment grew messy, dishes piled in the sink, the trash left to sour. At night, he lay awake listening to the silence. Sometimes he thought he heard Julia's voice in the darkness, the whisper of her shoes in the hall, the faint laugh of a woman who knew she had outplayed him. He would jolt upright, sweat slicking his skin, only to find the apartment empty. Crystal's psychiatrist eventually sent him a letter, delivered in a polite envelope. For her recovery, all contact must cease indefinitely. Michael read it twice, his hands trembling, then crumpled it in his fist. He had lost her too. One evening, he returned to the bedroom and set Julia's wedding ring on the table again, staring at it as though it might offer an answer. Instead, it mocked him with its stillness. The life he had built had collapsed piece by piece. His mistress was broken, his wife had vanished, his home had become a mausoleum. He was left with nothing but the echo of Julia's plan, a plan so precise it had gutted him without leaving a single wound the world could see. For the first time in his life, Michael Dawson felt utterly, irreparably alone. The northern city was colder, quieter, and that suited Julia Dawson perfectly. She arrived in late autumn, when the leaves had already turned brittle and the streets carried the smell of wood smoke. To her, it felt like stepping into a different life entirely. No one here knew her name, her history, or the shadow of what she had left behind in Portland. She rented a modest apartment on the edge of downtown, a place with plain walls and a view of the river. It wasn't home, not in the way the lake house once had been, but it was a shelter, a space untouched by betrayal. She unpacked only what she needed: clothes, a few medical textbooks, her laptop. The rest she left in sealed boxes, tucked away in a corner, as though she couldn't quite bring herself to let those remnants breathe. Her new job was with the State Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Fingerprint Identification Unit. It was quieter work than the morgue, less visceral, less drenched in grief. Here, Julia analyzed ridges and swirls, tiny loops of identity that spoke louder than any corpse could. She liked the precision of it, the anonymity. Each print was a puzzle, detached from the chaos of the living. She could lose herself in the patterns, her mind narrowing to details no one else noticed. Colleagues greeted her politely, asked her where she had transferred from. She gave them clipped answers, never mentioning Portland, never speaking Michael's name. To them, she was simply Dr. Dawson, a woman with steady hands and a reputation for meticulous work. They accepted her silence without pushing, perhaps sensing boundaries drawn too sharply to cross. Her life fell into rhythm. She woke early, walked the quiet streets to the bureau, spent hours beneath fluorescent lights, cataloging the hidden signatures of criminals. In the evenings, she returned to her apartment, cooked simple meals, read, and let the silence envelop her. It was a life stripped of noise, stripped of color. She told herself she preferred it that way. Yet, sometimes when she lay in bed at night, memories returned unbidden. The look on Crystal's face when she realized the bed held not her lover, but a corpse. The heaviness of Michael's hand as it went slack under the needle. The echo of Crystal's screams clawing through the walls of the lake house. Julia never smiled at the recollections, never allowed herself indulgence. They weren't victories. They were necessities, a response carved out of betrayal. Still, those memories gave her something she hadn't known she wanted: distance. They had freed her from the prison of being the dutiful wife, the woman who turned a blind eye. Only one tie remained from her old life: Rachel Myers. Rachel called her once a month, voice warm, carrying across the miles as if nothing had changed. Julia never told her where she had moved, never offered details, but she answered the calls all the same. Rachel had news to share, stories that reminded Julia of a world beyond vengeance. On one of those calls, Rachel's voice bubbled with happiness. "Daniel and I were expecting. 6 months from now. Can you believe it?" Julia sat by her apartment window, the phone pressed to her ear, the gray river drifting past below. For a moment, something softened in her. She could almost picture Rachel, glowing with joy, Daniel's steady hand at her side. They had found what she had lost, what she had buried. "That's good," Julia said quietly. "You'll be wonderful parents." Rachel laughed gently. "I wish you could be here, Jules. I really do. But I understand. You need your space." After the call ended, Julia remained at the window long after the sky turned dark. A strange calmness spread through her chest. She wasn't envious, not exactly. She felt no sharp stab of longing. What she felt was quieter, like the hum of a lullaby she hadn't heard in years. Her days passed like this: work, solitude, the occasional phone call. She never sought companionship, never accepted invitations from colleagues. There was safety in distance. The closer people came, the more dangerous it became. She had learned that lesson too well. And yet, despite the walls she built around herself, a measure of peace crept in. Not joy, not hope, but peace. She woke without dread. She walked without glancing over her shoulder. She worked without the shadow of betrayal looming in every corner. Her heart remained cold, and she preferred it that way. Warmth invited weakness. Weakness invited pain. But in the silence of her new city, Julia Dawson found a balance she hadn't thought possible. The woman who once crouched behind hydrangea bushes, heartbreaking as she spied on her husband, no longer existed. In her place stood someone forged in betrayal, sharpened by precision, tempered by silence. And though she rarely admitted it, not even to herself, a part of her knew this. She had survived. Michael Dawson's days blurred into one another, each one stripped of meaning. The apartment that once held the hum of conversation and the rhythm of ordinary life had become a hollow shell. He moved through it like a man exiled, haunted by silence. The wedding ring Julia left on the nightstand remained where he had found it, its gleam a daily reminder of how decisively she had ended everything. He tried to bury himself in work, but even there he faltered. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their whispers floating just out of reach. Rumors spread about Crystal Moore's breakdown, about Julia's sudden resignation, about what had truly happened at the lake house. No one confronted him directly, but the shift in their eyes told him he was no longer trusted. Once respected, now pitted, Michael found himself isolated. Crystal never returned his calls. The letter from her psychiatrist had been final, but Michael still hoped for a word, a sign, anything. Weeks passed, then months, until one morning he arrived at the precinct to learn that Crystal had left her job altogether. She had vanished from Portland, resigned quietly, her apartment emptied. No forwarding address, no trace. He realized then that Julia had destroyed not only their marriage, but also his affair. Crystal was gone, stripped from his life as thoroughly as Julia herself. And in the empty space left behind, Michael had only his own thoughts for company. Those thoughts were relentless. He replayed the night again and again, searching for proof that Crystal's horror had been an illusion. But in the recesses of his mind, he remembered the sting of the syringe, Julia's calm face, the certainty in her eyes. He remembered the desperation in Crystal's screams, the terror that had aged her in an instant. Whether or not there had been a corpse in that bed, Julia had orchestrated something he would never escape. Nights were the worst. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by jolts of panic. Sometimes he thought he heard Julia moving through the apartment, the click of her heels on the hardwood, the whisper of her voice calling his name. He would stumble out of bed, searching, only to find the rooms empty. He would return to his pillow, sweat-drenched, heart pounding, his mind circling back to the same truth. Julia hadn't needed to kill him. She had condemned him to something far worse. Meanwhile, Julia Dawson built her life far from Portland, in a city where no one knew her name. She buried herself in the meticulous work of fingerprint analysis, surrounded by colleagues who never asked about her past. They saw only a quiet, precise professional. She let them believe that. She lived simply, deliberately. Her apartment remained spare, her routines disciplined. She answered Rachel Myers's calls once in a while, smiling faintly at the sound of her friend's joy as she prepared for motherhood. But Julia never spoke of Michael, never spoke of Portland. The past had been cauterized, burned away. In quiet moments, she sometimes wondered if Michael still lay awake at night, wondering what had happened to him. She never let herself linger on it. His questions weren't her burden. His punishment was his own mind, gnawing at itself in solitude. That was enough. For Julia, justice had never been about courts or lawyers or signatures on divorce papers. It had been about balance. Michael had broken something sacred, and she had tilted the scales back in her favor. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or leave a visible scar. She had crafted something sharper, silence. Michael lived with that silence every day. Crystal vanished into it, and Julia carried it forward into a life that no longer looked backward. Justice did not always thunder through a gavel strike. Sometimes it moved quietly, unseen, a current no one could fight. Sometimes it was a woman walking away without a word, leaving behind nothing but a ring and an emptiness that could never be filled. Michael Dawson would never fully understand what Julia had done, or how. That was the brilliance of it. The unanswered questions would hound him forever, circling his mind like wolves in the dark. Alone, he would drown in them. And Julia, she never looked back. She had carved her freedom out of betrayal, rebuilt her life in silence, and discovered that the cold could be more merciful than fire. For her, the experiment was complete. For him, it had only just begun. I never imagined I'd be starting over at 65 with nothing but an old suitcase and a second-hand coat that didn't quite keep out the cold. Life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it, stripping you of the things you thought were solid: your career, your home, even the love of your own child. I used to think I was needed, respected even. After all, I had spent over 4 decades in the classroom, shaping young minds, wiping away tears, staying late to rewrite lesson plans, and showing up early to fix the coffee machine no one else would touch. I wasn't just a teacher. I was the woman who remembered birthdays, who kept spare pencils in her drawer, who still mailed handwritten thank you cards. My name was Margaret Hayes, and for 43 years, room 12B was my whole world. That world ended on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the clouds feel too low and everything smells like wet pavement and regret. I remember standing in front of the principal's office, my hands still damp from the hallway, thinking I was being called in about the new reading program. But when I walked in and saw Mr. Calhoun, not just the principal, but the district supervisor beside him, I knew. They didn't even sit me down, just handed me an envelope and said the district was moving in a new direction. The words felt like static. My heart thudded in my chest, and all I could think was, I'm not ready. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have savings. I wasn't supposed to be done yet. They called it a soft retirement. Said I should be proud that I'd earned a rest. But rest doesn't pay rent, and pride doesn't fill a fridge. I left the school with my nameplate, a small box of books, and a grief I couldn't quite explain. I wasn't just losing a job. I was losing my rhythm, my purpose, my place in the world. Still, I told myself not to panic. I had Brian, my only son. He and his wife, Lori, had a nice house on the edge of town, 2 kids, a golden retriever, the whole catalog picture life. Surely they wouldn't let me struggle alone. After everything I'd done, raising Brian alone after his father left, working 2 jobs to get him through college, helping with the down payment on that very house, I believed deep in my bones that he'd be there for me now. But belief, I would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing. Brian opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lori stood behind him, arms crossed, eyebrows already pinched with concern, or maybe annoyance. The kids were upstairs, their laughter faint through the ceiling. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh baked bread, and for a second I let myself believe I was home. But the warmth faded quickly. I sat at their kitchen island, clutching my purse like it might anchor me. Brian poured coffee, the same way I used to for him during finals week, and asked, "So, what's going on, Mom?" I told him everything. How the district had let me go, how I'd gotten a small severance, but nothing that would last, how I just needed a little time to figure out what came next. I didn't ask for much. Just a couch, maybe a spare room, a few weeks, a place to breathe. Lori didn't say much at first, just stirred her tea with a slow, repetitive clink. Brian leaned back, exhaling like I'd dropped a burden into his lap. "It's not that we don't want to help," he began, and already my stomach turned. "It's just the house is kind of tight right now. The kids have their own rooms. Lori's working remotely, and I need the garage for my studio setup. There's not really a space that makes sense." I smiled politely. "The couch is fine. I won't be in the way." Lori looked up, finally. "It's not just space, Margaret. It's the kids. They've got their routines, their homework zones. And we haven't really child-proofed things for, someone older." Child-proofed for someone older. The words hit harder than they should have, like I was a hazard, a walking disruption. I looked at Brian, hoping for even a flicker of warmth. Instead, I got silence. "I could help," I offered. "Around the house. With groceries, laundry. I won't be a burden." Brian ran a hand through his hair. "Didn't you save anything for retirement?" I wanted to lie. Wanted to say yes, that I'd planned ahead. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. I'd put everything into him, his college tuition, their first mortgage, even that emergency fund when Lori lost her job a few years back. I had chosen him over and over again, and now there was nothing left. I thought I had more time, I said quietly. Lori stood. Maybe a senior community would be better. Some of them are affordable and they're suited to your needs. My throat closed. I didn't have the money for that. I barely had enough for groceries. Brian looked away. Mom, I just don't know what else we can do right now. That was it. No warmth, no promise to revisit the idea, no hug at the door. Just 2 polite smiles and 1,000 unspoken ways of saying, we don't want you here. They let me stay one night. A mercy. I slept in the guest room, still painted with pastel clouds from when the kids were babies. In the morning, Lori handed me a bag of muffins and a folded blanket, in case it gets cold. Brian walked me to the curb, where my car sat like a reminder of everything I didn't have. He didn't say much. Just, let me know when you get settled, okay? Settled where? I drove away with no destination, no plan, and the quiet ache of realizing that love, real love, should never come with conditions. The RV had been sitting in storage for years, tucked behind my friend Sandra's old barn. It was a 1991 Winnebago with peeling paint and a leak in the skylight. I bought it back when I still believed in road trips and second chances. It smelled like dust, rust, and forgotten plans. But it was mine. I parked it in a lot near the highway, where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. At night, I curled up on the built-in bench with my coat pulled tight, listening to the low hum of 18-wheelers groaning past. The thin insulation didn't hold back the cold. My breath fogged the windows. Sometimes I left the radio on just to pretend I wasn't alone. Each morning, I'd wipe the condensation off the windshield and drive aimlessly through town, searching for jobs. I printed out my resume at the library, typed out in Times New Roman, like that would make me look more capable, and walked it into every business with a help wanted sign in the window. A grocery store manager looked me up and down before saying, "We're looking for someone a bit more active. Stocking shelves takes muscle, ma'am." At a motel front desk, the young woman barely glanced at my application before asking if I even knew how to use their booking software. I even offered to clean rooms. She smiled politely and said, "We already have someone, but thank you." The worst was the gas station on 5th and Clover. The owner looked sympathetic, then said, "People don't like being reminded of their mothers when they buy cigarettes." He chuckled like it was a joke. My knees ached after a few hours of walking. I stopped counting how many times I was told, "We'll keep your resume on file." Some didn't even bother lying. I ate peanut butter on crackers most days. The little money I had left went to gas and a gym membership, not to work out, but to shower. I started avoiding mirrors. My skin looked thin, my eyes older than I remembered. I tried calling Brian once. Just once. It went to voicemail. "Hey," I said softly. "Just wanted to hear your voice. I'm okay, just wanted to check in." I hung up before I could say I miss you, before I could beg. He never called back. Lori sent a text a few days later. "Hope you're doing all right. The kids say hi." I stared at the message for a long time. The kids don't have phones. Lori must have typed it herself. I didn't respond. One night, the rain came hard. It slipped through the cracked skylight and soaked the blanket I'd been sleeping under. I sat up, shivering, water dripping down my neck. The mattress was damp. The roof creaked. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and whispered, "Is this it? Is this where I end?" I had no one left to call. No safety net. Just the hum of the highway and the loneliness of a life that had moved on without me. And just when I thought it couldn't get any darker, my phone rang. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed on the tiny ledge beside the sink. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize, area code I hadn't seen in years. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was tired, soaked to the skin, and the last thing I needed was another spam caller asking about my car warranty. But something in me, a flicker I hadn't felt in weeks, urged me to pick up. "Hello." My voice cracked from disuse. There was a pause, then a voice, smooth and steady. "Is this Margaret Hayes. I hesitated. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Ethan Miller. I'm sorry to call so late. I hope I didn't wake you. Ethan Miller. The name didn't land at first. Then something clicked. A pair of too big glasses. A boy in the back row who never raised his hand, but always turned in perfect essays. I hadn't said his name aloud in over 30 years. Ethan, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, from Ridgeway Elementary. He laughed softly. Yeah, that Ethan. I've been looking for you. I sat down on the damp bench, stunned. Why? Another pause. Then, because I owe you more than you'll ever know. He told me everything. How he'd been the kid no one believed in. The one teachers gave up on because he didn't talk much, didn't play sports, didn't fit the mold. But I had seen something in him. I had given him a journal. I remembered now, the blue one with a silver clasp. I'd written inside the cover, "Your words matter. Keep writing." He did. Ethan Miller was now the CEO of a successful publishing company in Seattle. He had a wife, 2 children, and a foundation that funded literacy programs for underprivileged youth. He said he'd been trying to track me down for months. My name had popped up in an alumni article about retirees, but then nothing. No address, no public profile, no trace. Until today, he said. I ran into Mr. Daniels. He taught music after you left. He mentioned something about you living in an RV. I'm sorry if this is intrusive, but I could not call. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not shame, hope. I don't know what to say, I murmured. You don't have to say anything, he replied. Just let me help. I didn't know how to respond. The silence stretched, thick and uncertain. I'm not calling out of pity, he added. I'm calling because you changed my life, and I'd like to return the favor if you'll let me. No one had said anything like that to me in a long, long time. I looked around at the dim RV, the stained ceiling, the soaked blanket. I thought of Brian's face when he told me there was no room for me. And then I thought of Ethan, a boy I barely remembered, reaching across time to lift me up when I had nothing left. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. I'll think about it, I whispered. But thank you, Ethan. Truly. Any time, he said. And Margaret, you were never forgotten. The apartment wasn't flashy. It wasn't perched on a hill or nestled in a luxury high-rise. But it had sunlight, real, warm sunlight that poured through the tall windows every morning and danced across the hardwood floors. The kitchen was small but new, with a little breakfast nook that looked out over the water. The bedroom held a queen-size bed with sheets so soft I cried the first night I laid on them. Ethan had arranged everything. Quietly, respectfully. No fanfare. He wired enough money to cover the deposit and a year of rent. Insisted on helping furnish it. Just the basics, he said. But even the basics felt like a palace after weeks in the cold. I bought groceries for the first time in a month. Real food. Fresh eggs. A bag of oranges. Whole milk in a glass bottle. I made a pot of stew, the kind I used to cook on snow days when Brian was little, and the smell wrapped around me like a blanket. I started waking up early again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I took slow walks along the pier, watching the fishermen prep their boats and the seagulls argue overhead. I went to the library and checked out books I hadn't read in years. I even joined a small book club at the community center. They welcomed me like I'd always belonged. And I started writing, just a little at first. Memories, letters I never sent, short reflections on the classroom, on motherhood, on the strange shape of silence after you've been cast aside. Ethan had offered me a part-time consulting role with his foundation. Nothing demanding, just reviewing children's manuscripts, giving feedback, helping train new mentors. I accepted. For the first time in a long time, I felt useful again. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my new bathroom. My hair was brushed and softly curled. I wore a deep green cardigan, my favorite brooch pinned at the collar. I looked alive. I looked like myself, not the woman who had been turned away at her son's door, not the figure hunched in the corner of an RV, shivering under a wet blanket, but Margaret Hayes, teacher, survivor, woman reborn. I poured a cup of tea, opened my laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor. There were still bills to think about, still scars that hadn't quite faded. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Then, just as I was beginning to feel truly settled, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Brian. I stared at it. The steam from my tea curled in the air between us like a ghost. He called again, and again. By the fourth ring, I picked up. Mom. Brian's voice was hesitant, thin, like a thread stretched too tight. I leaned back in my chair, one hand wrapped around the warm mug of tea, the other resting on my lap. Hi, Brian. My voice was calm, steady, almost foreign to myself. I've been trying to reach you, he said quickly. I was worried. Were you? I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I let the silence do the work. I heard you moved, he continued. Laurie's sister mentioned it. Something about a place near the marina. Ah, so that's how the rumor started. A neighbor, a casual comment, a little too much curiosity. I wondered how long it took before someone mentioned that I'd gotten back on my feet, and how fast that news traveled to their dinner table. I just wanted to see how you were, he added, softer this time. It's been a rough few weeks for us. There it was, the opening act. I'm well, I said simply. Pause. Then, would you like to meet for lunch? Just the two of us. I feel like we need to talk. A month ago, I would have said yes before he finished the sentence. But today, I didn't answer right away. I let the weight of his silence press into the line between us. Finally, I said, all right. We met at a bistro downtown. The kind Laurie used to complain was too expensive. Brian chose it. Probably thought it would impress me. I arrived early, sat by the window, watching people pass by, clutching their coats against the wind. When Brian walked in, he looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to look different. My hair was done. My clothes were neat, tailored. I carried myself like someone who didn't need anything. Mom, he said, blinking. You look great. I feel great. We ordered. Small talk followed. Stiff. Empty. He asked about my apartment. I told him about the book club. He nodded in all the right places, smiled at all the right times. But there was something behind his eyes. Tension. A calculation. Finally, he set his fork down and sighed. Things have been tough lately. Really tough. I nodded slowly. I'm sorry to hear that. The mortgage is piling up, he said. Laurie's hours got cut, and the kids, well, you know how expensive school is now. I sipped my water. We were thinking, he continued, forcing a chuckle, since things are going well for you now, maybe you could, I don't know, help us out a bit? Just until we catch up. For the kids. There it was, the real reason for lunch. I set my glass down gently. When I asked to stay with you, just until I figured things out, do you remember what you said? His face reddened slightly. Mom, come on. That was different. We didn't know. No, I interrupted, soft but firm. You did know. You knew I had nowhere to go. And you made your choice. He looked down at his plate. I was overwhelmed. We didn't expect you to lose everything. I finished for him. Neither did I. He looked up, eyes wide. So that's it? You won't help us? I smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of smile that comes after surviving a storm. Lunch is on me, Brian. Consider it my only contribution. He stared at me, stunned. You can't be serious. You have money now. You're living in a beautiful place. And we're your family. Family. That word. So easy to say when there's something to gain. You're right, I said quietly. And when I needed mine, I was sleeping in a leaking RV. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I stood, adjusted my coat, and looked at him one last time. Take care of your kids, Brian. But this time, you'll have to do it without me. Then I walked away. No drama, no tears, no turning back. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left behind. The sun spilled across my windows that morning like warm honey. Outside, the ocean moved slow and steady, breathing in and out like it had all the time in the world. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, the smell of coffee drifting through the air, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was late for something. I didn't feel like I was behind or chasing or proving. I was just living. I spent the next few days doing things that had no urgency, no purpose beyond joy. I planted rosemary in a clay pot for the balcony. I bought a second-hand bicycle with a wicker basket and rode it down the path by the dunes. I read poetry out loud in my living room, just for the sound of it. Brian didn't call again. Neither did Lori. And strangely, that didn't hurt anymore. The wound was still there, of course. It always would be. But it had scarred over, tough and quiet. I had grieved what needed to be grieved. And now I was building something new in its place. Ethan visited once, with his wife and 2 kids. We sat out on the patio with lemonade and laughed about the old days. He told me they were naming their new scholarship after me, the Hayes Fund. I didn't cry in front of them. But when they left, I held the note he'd written in my hand for a long time. You gave me my voice when I didn't have one. Now it's your turn to be heard. That night, I opened my laptop again. The cursor blinked on the screen like a pulse. I didn't know what I was writing yet. Maybe a memoir. Maybe just a letter to the woman I used to be. But I knew this much. I would never beg for love again. I would never shrink to make someone else comfortable. And I would never forget what it felt like to stand in the rain with nowhere to go. Because that memory, that ache, was what would keep me grounded. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always about letting someone back in. Sometimes it's about letting go for yourself. I stood by the window, watching the last light of the day dip beneath the horizon. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full. Full of possibility, full of peace, full of me.